You all for coming. I don't have slides. I've come to believe that power corrupts and PowerPoints corrupt absolutely. I am a developmental psychologist specializing in adolescence, and I study the relationship between adolescent brain development and adolescent psychological development. And what I'd like to do this morning is to talk a little bit about what we've discovered in recent decades about the adolescent brain and the implications of these discoveries for our education and labor force policies that affect young people in this country. We need a new way of thinking about adolescence that can be informed by this neuroscience. I think if you are the parent of a teenager and you've ever visited a bookstore in which they have books aimed at raising kids during this stage of life, what you will find on those shelves are a lot of survival guides. And actually, if you look at the titles of books aimed at parents of teenagers, you will be amazed at the number of them that have the word survive or survival in the title. There actually is a book out there, and I'm not kidding about this, called How to Survive Your Dog's Adolescence. But this apparently is a cross-species problem that we need to deal with. I think that because we have stereotyped this period as one in which the best possible outcome is to survive it, we have not spent a great deal of time thinking about how we might make it into a time when people thrive rather than simply survive. And I think that that has led at the policy level to a disproportionate investment in resources and programs designed to prevent problems rather than to facilitate positive development. And while it is important to prevent problems, and I don't mean to minimize the fact that large numbers of young people in this country do have serious problems that we ought to address as educators and policymakers and parents, that the majority of kids don't. And that what the majority of young people in this country need are educational and vocational opportunities that help them develop in positive directions. And I believe that the neuroscience of adolescence is confirming this different kind of vision and supporting it. Now we need to go from this new way of thinking about adolescence as a period in which people can really thrive to policies that take advantage of these discoveries. So the principal discovery that I want to share with you this morning is that it turns out that adolescence is a time of remarkable brain plasticity. Now, plasticity is the word that neuroscientists use to refer to the capacity of the brain to be influenced and shaped by experience. I know that everyone in this room is familiar with research showing that the early years, 0 to 5, let's say, comprise a time of tremendous brain plasticity, and that's why it has been important and continues to be important to invest in early childhood education and quality childcare during this age period. It's a relatively recent revelation that there is a second burst in brain plasticity that takes place during adolescence, largely as a consequence of the impact of puberty on the brain. So we typically think of puberty as something that changes our sexual function and reproductive function and external appearance, but we also now understand that puberty has some fairly remarkable effects on the way the brain develops and on the way the brain functions. And one of those effects is to make the brain more plastic, that is, more malleable and more easily affected by experience. Now, this has a couple of important implications. One is that because plasticity cuts both ways, it makes adolescence both a time of vulnerability, that is, when people can be easily harmed by exposure to toxic experiences, because the brain is susceptible to change at this point in time, but it also makes adolescence a time of opportunity when we can take advantage of facilitative experiences that also draw on the brain's malleability and capacity for change. Now, when when the brain is plastic, as it is during early childhood and during adolescence, or especially plastic during those ages, it is not plastic in all regions of the brain or in all brain systems at the same point in time. So, for example, during the early years, the brain's visual cortex, the part of the brain that regulates our ability to see, is highly plastic, and those of you who've raised children know that during the first year or year and a half of life, babies become much better at seeing things. Babies are not born with 20/20 vision. It develops over time. But you may also have noticed that kids don't become better at seeing things after they're 1.5 or 2 years old. One of the reasons for that is that that part of the brain loses its plasticity and it's no longer affected by environmental experience. Some parts of the brain are plastic longer than that. Language acquisition is a good example of that. So we know that it is much more difficult to acquire a second language after childhood, that is after puberty, than it is before. And that's because language acquisition systems of the brain become far less plastic at that point in time. So it's not impossible to learn a second language as an adult, but it's much more difficult than it is to learn it when you're a young child. So when we talk about brain plasticity during adolescence, it's important to say something about where the brain is particularly plastic during this time period. And it turns out that one of the major regions where the brain is plastic during adolescence is the prefrontal cortex. That is the part of the brain right behind your forehead. The prefrontal cortex is the brain's CEO. It is the part of the brain that's responsible for advanced thinking abilities, what psychologists often refer to as executive function. But it's also the part of the brain that's responsible for self-regulation or self-control, the ability to exercise willful control over our thoughts and our behaviors and our feelings. These two aspects of prefrontal functioning are important for understanding labor force development because clearly the kinds of jobs that we have available now and that we will certainly continue to see available in the future require advanced thinking abilities. So to the extent that the prefrontal cortex is still plastic during adolescence, this suggests that we ought to be trying to facilitate prefrontal development in our educational systems to help build the advanced thinking skills that kids will need to be successful as they continue their education and ultimately move into the labor force. My interest has not been so much on these advanced thinking skills, but on the development of self-regulation, which has been neglected, I think, in our discussion of what educational institutions ought to be emphasizing in their treatment of young people of this age. Self-regulation falls into the broader category of what many economists and psychologists call non-cognitive skills, or soft skills. And self-regulation, it turns out, is extremely predictive of success in school and in the labor force. In fact, many studies have now confirmed that self-control is a better predictor of who does well in school than IQ is. And it's a better predictor of who does well in the labor force than talent is. And so anything that we can do to help facilitate stronger self-regulation and stronger self-control in young people is going to increase their chances for success in life. Now, one other impact of puberty on the brain, in addition to making it more plastic, is that puberty and pubertal hormones arouse the brain's reward centers in ways that make individuals much more likely to go after experiences that they find exciting or potentially pleasurable. I'm sure all of you are familiar with the neurotransmitter dopamine. Dopamine is the main brain chemical that is active in pathways when we experience reward or pleasure, and it's active regardless of what the source of the pleasure is. And so when we either experience or anticipate rewarding things like food or sex or money or praise, we have an increase in dopamine activity, which is what lets us feel good from the experience or anticipation of that stimulus. Because of the impact of puberty on the brain, there is more dopamine activity in the brain's reward centers during adolescence than at any other point in human development. Now, The bad news for all of us in this room is that what that means is that nothing will ever feel as good to you for the rest of your life as it did when you were a teenager. But a more serious implication of that is that this increase in dopamine activity at puberty inclines young people to go after experiences that are often risky and reckless. And this is going on at a time when the prefrontal cortex is still developing and where the capacity for self-regulation is still somewhat immature. And so we have likened the situation to that of a car with the accelerator pressed down to the floor before there's a very good braking system in place. And so one reason to focus on building self-control and self-regulation is to help provide kids with the tools they'll need to resist impulses to get involved in behaviors that can be harmful or even life-threatening. Now, I want to just link this theme back to some of the presentations that were made yesterday about the importance of intervening during early childhood. I don't think anyone would argue with the fact that that's critical to do. But I sometimes feel that our emphasis on early childhood as a point of intervention has distracted us from thinking about other times in the child's life when it's critical to invest resources in facilitating development. And if you look at some of the work by Jim Heckman and others, the studies that they have done on non-cognitive skills have found not only that early childhood is an important point of intervention, but that adolescence is, at least for the development of things like self-regulation, an equally important point of intervention. That happens to be buried in the footnotes and never emphasized in the headlines, but it's there if you look at the studies. And I can only say that I get nervous when we lead the public to believe that early childhood intervention is some sort of inoculation. It's not. It's an investment, but we need to continue to provide booster shots along the way, and adolescence is a critical time when we ought to be applying these booster shots. Now, we know a few things about what we can do to help facilitate stronger self-control and stronger self-regulation during adolescence. One of them is by educating parents on how to raise children according to a style that we have talked about as authoritative parenting, which is a parenting approach that combines being very warm with being very firm. There is 5 decades of research showing that children raised under such circumstances have better self-regulatory skills than kids who are raised in a permissive or an authoritarian household. A second thing that we know is that challenging young people to engage in higher order thinking abilities in school helps facilitate better self-regulation as well, because these challenges operate on the very same brain systems. And the very sad news about American higher education is that our high schools, by and large, are not very good, especially compared to high schools in other developed nations. And surveys of young people in America and in other countries bear this out. So young people who have come from other countries and studied in American high schools for part of their high school career tell us that American high schools are much easier and much more boring than high schools are in their countries. And along similar lines, American students who have spent time studying abroad during their high school years say that high schools in other countries are more challenging than they are here. So we need to do a lot to improve the quality of high school education in ways that challenges kids to reach a little bit higher. I know that the popular coverage of high school in America tends to emphasize the stress that young people are under. And while I don't want to discount that, I will say that the evidence is that most young people in this country are not stressed by challenging high schools, but are bored by high schools that don't demand very much from them. And we're not going to solve the labor force problems that we anticipate unless we can make high schools better. And let me just conclude then by saying that policy calls to increase access to higher education are fine, they're all well and good, but if the young people who are going into post-secondary institutions don't have the capacity to succeed there, it doesn't really matter if we provide the economic resources for young people to pursue their educations beyond that. So we really need to take advantage of what we're learning from neuroscience teach parents how to be better parents of teenagers, and get schools to become more challenging for young people, both for the development of the higher order thinking abilities that they'll need to be successful, but also for the development of soft skills that we now know are critical for labor market success. Thanks.